American Constitution. I favor the American system of individual enterprise, and I am opposed to any general extension of government ownership and control. I believe not only in advocating economy and public expenditure, but in its practical application and actual accomplishment. I believe in a reduction and reform of taxation, and shall continue my efforts in that direction.
The costs of government are all assessed upon the people. This means that the farmer is doomed to provide a certain amount of money out of the sale of his produce, no matter how low the price, to pay his taxes. The manufacturer, the professional man, the clerk must do the same from their income. The expenses of the government reach everybody. Taxes take from everyone a part of his earnings and force everyone to work for a certain part of his time for the government. Such a sum is difficult to comprehend. It represents all the pay of 5 million wage earners receiving $5 a day, working 300 days in the year. If the government should add $100 million of expense, it would represent 4 days more work of these wage earners. These are some of the reasons why I want to cut down public expense. I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves.
The sudden death of Mr. Coolidge came as a painful shock to all Americans, for the ex-president had appeared in good health and form during the last year.
We have to maintain the confidence in the system because it's a voluntary system of payment of our taxes.
Agreed. The Federal Reserve was created by Congress in 1913, and it was entrusted with the power granted originally to the Congress by the U.S. Constitution to coin money and regulate the value thereof.
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
My concern about the legislation is that if the GAO is auditing not only the operational aspects of our programs and the details of the programs, but is making judgments about our policy decisions, that would effectively be a takeover of monetary policy by the Congress, a repudiation of the independence of the Federal Reserve, which would be highly destructive to the stability of the financial system, the dollar, and our national economic situation.
This evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. Any failure traceable to arrogance or our lack of comprehension or readiness to sacrifice would inflict upon us grievous hurt, both at home and abroad. Progress toward these noble goals is persistently threatened by the conflict now engulfing the world. It commands our whole attention, absorbs our very beings. We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. Unhappily, the danger it poses promises to be of indefinite duration. To meet it successfully, there is call for not so much the emotional and transitory sacrifices of crisis, but rather those which enable us to carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint, the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle with liberty the stake. Crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. A huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow.
There are those who have been involved in the drone killings who actually believe that they aren't helping our country. This is a letter from 4 American servicemen in the Air Force to President Obama from a year or 2 ago. And it reads, "We are former Air Force service members who have been involved in the drone program. We joined the Air Force to protect American lives and to protect our Constitution. We came to the realization that innocent civilians we were killing only fueled the feelings of hatred that ignited terrorism in groups like ISIS, while also serving as a fundamental recruitment tool. This administration, then referring to the Obama administration, and its predecessors have built a drone program that is one of the most devastating driving forces for terrorism and destabilization around the world. The power to kill anyone, anywhere, anytime is an ominous power. I think most of the people involved in the program, including President Obama, had motives to kill our enemies, to kill those who they thought might come someday and kill us. But the program has become so extensive and extended across so many different countries that there is concern, one, about the civilians, women and children that are being killed in these strikes as collateral damage. But there's also some concern whether or not that kind of ominous power, the power to kill anyone, anywhere, anytime, in the entire world, whether or not that power is so ominous that there should be checks and balances. Shouldn't we at least consider, though, whether or not there should be checks and balances and whether or not one person can make the decision to kill? I think that this is something that should be debated, discussed, and should have oversight from Congress. You will recall that in Obama's administration, the drone attacks really hit a new peak. You will recall that he made his decisions on who to approve the killing of on Terrorism Tuesdays. There were reports that flashcards were used in the discussion of who was to be killed. There were also reports that John Brennan had complete authority to kill on his own in certain places. John Brennan also responded and said, when asked about the drone program, that there are no geographical limitations to where we can kill. That's a little bit worrisome, particularly since Congress has never authorized war in the 7 different countries where President Obama utilized drones and where drones continue to be used. People say, well, this isn't really war, or this has something to do with 9/11. This has nothing to do with 9/11. None of these people had anything to do with 9/11. People say, well, they're associated forces. That's not in the 9/11 authorization. Congress voted after 9/11 and said you can go after those who organized it, aided, abetted, those who helped to plan, those who helped the attackers of 9/11. It didn't say you could go after any far-flung religious radical or ideologue throughout the world and kill them, but that's what we do. I had this debate with the Obama administration, and I asked them directly, can you kill an American with a drone? Interestingly, they hesitated to answer that question. They finally did say, we're not going to kill an American not involved in combat in the United States with a drone. It took 13 hours to get that answer from them. There are questions about what happens to an American accused and put on the kill list. Can we kill an American overseas? Often the killings aren't people marching around with muskets. They aren't people marching around shooting at each other in a war where it's like you got a war zone and you're dropping a bomb on the other side of the war. These are often people sitting in a hut somewhere, eating dinner. These are often people, we kill them where we find them. We often don't know the names of those who are killed. We often have no idea in the end who is killed in these attacks. But the question is whether or not we should allow a select few to be the overseers. And often these overseers aren't a check and a balance. These overseers are people who simply say, well, we want to be consulted. Well, when the president comes to you or the CIA comes to you and says, we're going to kill this person, oh, you've been consulted, often consulted after the fact, but you've been consulted. That to me is not a check and a balance. That is you being a rubber stamp for the policy. So the question has come up time and again, and the media looks and says, oh my goodness, this is a conspiracy theory, the deep state. There actually is a deep state, and the deep state's been around for decades and decades. In fact, the Church Commission in the 70s was set up to investigate the deep state.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks.
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
When we, the CIA, wanted to circulate disinformation on a particular issue, disinformation is not necessarily a lie. It may be a half-truth. And we would pick out a journalist. I would go do the briefing and hope that he would put the information in print.
What was your percentage of success?
We were pretty successful in planning information of a rather rarefied nature. For instance, if we wanted to get across to the American public that the North Vietnamese were building up their force structure in South Vietnam, I would go to a journalist and advise him that in the past 6 months, X number of North Vietnamese forces had come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail system through southern Laos. Now, there is no way a journalist can check that information. That's data derived from radio intercepts, spy in the sky photography. So either he goes with the information or he doesn't, and ordinarily or usually the journalist would go with it because it looked like some kind of exclusive. And I would say our percentage planning that kind of data was 70 to 80%.
Can you recall the names of any of the correspondents you used in that manner?
Used is a loaded term. The correspondents we targeted were those who had terrific influence, the most respected journalists in Saigon, like Robert Chaplin of the New Yorker magazine, Kai's Beach of the Los Angeles Times from time to time, and also he worked for the Chicago Daily News. Bud Merrick of U.S. News and World Report, Malcolm Brown of the New York Times, even Maynard Parker of Newsweek magazine. We would go after these gentlemen. I would be directed to cultivate them, to spend time with them at the Caravel Hotel or the Continental Hotel, to socialize with them, and slowly but surely to try to gain their confidence by dolloping out valid information which was true. And then I would drop into a conversation the data that we wanted to get across, which might not be true.
Well, it may very well be that the Rockefeller report is just the tip of the iceberg. We welcome it, and we will give serious consideration to the recommendations made by the Rockefeller Commission. But the report is limited, and our work must probe much deeper into the subject.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them. I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations of the period of the 1970s, it seems to me that a reporter's got to be much more circumspect in doing it now, or he runs the risk of at least being looked at with considerable disfavor by the public. I think you've got to be much more careful about it.
Look, we've had a top 20 kill list for 20 years. We just keep replenishing it with more and more and more. It's a never-ending top 20 list. The deep state has circled its wagons.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. The full power of centralized government. This was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. Realize we're in a war that must be won. Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation. And they say if we'll only avoid any direct confrontation with the enemy, he'll forget his evil ways and learn to love us. All who oppose them are indicted as warmongers. They say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. Not an easy answer, but simple. If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based on what we know in our hearts is morally right, we cannot buy our security, our freedom from the threat of the bomb, by committing an immorality so great as saying to 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom, because to save our own skins, we're willing to make a deal with your slave masters. Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us that the greater risk lies in appeasement, and this is the specter our well-meaning liberal friends refuse to face, that their policy of accommodation is appeasement, and it gives no choice between peace and war, only between fight or surrender. If we continue to accommodate, continue to back and retreat, eventually we have to face the final demand, the ultimatum. And what then? Well, Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be. He has told them that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday, when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by that time, we will have been weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically. He believes this because from our side he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better read than dead, or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay, there is a point beyond which they must not advance. This is the meaning, in the phrase of Barry Goldwater, peace through strength. Winston Churchill said the destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals. And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
Headed for the limousine, and I heard some noise, and I thought it was firecrackers. And the next thing I knew, one of the Secret Service agents behind me just seized me here by the waist and plunged me head first into the limo. I landed on the seat, and the seat divider was down, and then he dived in on top of me. The shot that got me caromed off the side of the limousine and hit me while I was diving into the car. And it hit me back here under the arm, and then hit a rib, and that's what caused an extreme pain. And then it turned instead of edgewise and went tumbling down to within an inch of my heart.
Now, Dr. King was investigated, among other things, for matters of, I think you call it delicacy. Would that be a basis for investigating an American citizen by the FBI?
No. How did the Bureau come to launch the COINTEL program, and what in essence did COINTELPRO accomplish? Well, the program as such, as I can reconstruct from the files, was indicated to concern over the conspiratorial efforts of certain groups. Now, did the Bureau ever seek direction or counsel from the Attorney General on any of its COINTELPRO efforts or specific programs? As best as I can reconstruct, Senator, there was no direct authority requested from any Attorney General for the initiation of these programs, and it's only a question, as your staff presented yesterday, that the Attorney Generals, Presidents, Congress had been made available of certain aspects of programs after the fact. It's just like the Smith Act of 1940, which is designed to prevent revolutionary groups from advocating the overthrow of the government, and then subsequent interpretations as to the constitutionality of it leaves us with a statute still on the books that prescribes certain actions, but yet the degree of proof necessary to operate under the few remaining areas is such that there was no satisfactory way to proceed.
What you're saying, Mr. Manal, is that because, Mr. Adams, excuse me, is that you didn't operate within the law because the law didn't give you sufficient latitude.
We had men who felt there was an immediate danger to the country. They felt they had a responsibility to act, and having felt this responsibility, did act. And this is the whole problem we have at the present time.
Mr. Chairman, my time is long since expired. I would like to note that I saw Mr. Kelly on the Today Show this morning indicating strong support for responsible congressional oversight, and I
Yes,
think
sir.
that's a healthy attitude.
Well, I think it must come because, as you have really conceded, you shouldn't have ever had to have had guidelines to tell you that the federal government's chief law enforcement agency ought not to disobey the law. And really, you don't need explicit guidelines to tell you that, or you shouldn't have. Wouldn't you agree?
I would say that looking at it today, we should have looked at it that way yesterday.
Included in this COINTEL were activities like this: anonymous letters drafted by bureau offices in the field, sent to headquarters in Washington, approved, and then put in the mail, intended to break up marriages. Anonymous letters to university officials and to the several newspapers in that city to prevent university facilities from being made available to a speaker whom the Bureau disapproved. In that case, an anonymous letter was sent to me making protest. As an anonymous letter, it never occurred to me that it came from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A series of anonymous letters, one with the spelling very poor, the grammar sloppy, and another more sophisticated. Yes or no, are those actions regarded now by the Bureau as within bounds?
No, sir.
Why were they regarded as within bounds when they were approved by the Bureau? Everything I've summarized rather poorly was approved by the Bureau at the time, by headquarters, not field office X. The concept of the program seems to do violence to the First Amendment, because everything that you did sought to silence somebody, or frighten somebody into silence, or deny somebody a platform, or create an atmosphere in which people were in fact afraid to assemble. Now, sometimes law enforcement, legitimate law enforcement, has what we call this chilling effect. When it's legitimate law enforcement, oftentimes that chilling effect is a necessary, though regrettable, side effect. But what I'm talking about, and what these files are full of, are actions the only purpose of which is to chill.
In this document, the director of the FBI issued an instruction to all special agents of the Bureau as to the kind of information that he wanted them to collect and report on. I will just refer to a couple of the specific examples of what the FBI agents are required to report into the field. In the area of finances, who are the so-called angels for the group? In the area of publications, describe all the publications. In the area of religion, the policy of what the organization relating to its approach to religion, and any vehement statements made against religious bodies by leaders. Conversely, any statements of support for the movement by religious groups or individuals. In the area of political activities, any and all political activities in which so-called New Left leaders are involved, and details relating to their position taken on political matters, including efforts to influence public opinion, the electorate, and government bodies. In the area of education, all information concerning courses given, together with any educational outline, and together with what is the assigned or suggested reading. In the area of so-called social reform, all information on activities in connection with demonstrations aimed at social reform, whatever that may be. In the area of labor, all information, including all activity in the labor field. With respect to the public appearance of leaders, the identity of any leader who makes a public appearance on radio and television, and who appears before groups, for example, labor, church, and minority groups. And in connection with such appearances, the identity of the group, sponsoring the speaker, and a succinct summary of the subject matter discussed. In the area of mass media, influence of the New Left on mass media, and any indications of support of the New Left by the mass media. A wholly comprehensive listing of everything those people thought or did on any subject you can imagine they're having a concern with. As a next example of how the intelligence desire seeks out information in the area of women's liberation. Report after report about meetings of women who got together to talk about their problems. Now, how the Bureau got this information is not entirely clear, but it's apparently by informants. So we have informants running all over the country, checking up about what housewives are talking about in their efforts to decide whether women should have a different role in the society. Bureau agents were told to attack the New Left by disinformation and misinformation, and I will give you 6 quick examples of what was done pursuant to that program. There was a body called the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. At the time of the Democratic National Convention in 1968, that body attempted to obtain housing in Chicago for demonstrators who would come to the convention. The FBI local office in Chicago obtained 217 of those forms and filled them out with fictitious names and addresses of persons who purported falsely to have houses in which the demonstrators could stay. The tactic had its designed effect because, according to FBI documents, the persons who went out to look for these houses made, quotes, long and useless journeys to locate the addresses, and the effort to find housing was canceled. Precisely the same tactic and program was carried out by the Bureau with respect to the 1969 presidential inauguration, where they again filled out false housing forms to confuse and disrupt efforts by persons coming to Washington to find places to stay. What did the FBI do? They found out what citizen band was being used for walkie-talkies, and they used that citizen band to supply the marshals with misinformation, and pretending to be a unit of the National Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam, countermanded the orders issued by the movement. The new Attorney General in 1948 instructed the FBI to prepare an emergency detention program following something called the Attorney General's portfolio. This included plans to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. It included ultimately plans for a master warrant of arrest, whereby on the signature of the Attorney General and only that signature and without reference to the courts, thousands of people could be locked up.
Have they continued to maintain these files for lockup purposes?
The key question is your last 3 words, Senator. They have continued upon the agreement of the Department of Justice to maintain the same files. The numbers have now been reduced to 1,200 persons. The name has been changed to something called the Administrative Index. What purpose that serves and whether it still is used as a reserve list of persons to lock up, I think we're going to have to ask the Bureau, and I can't give you a definitive answer.
The FBI has never had a statute clearly defining its authority. And after all these many years, this is the first serious congressional investigation of its activities. And we have seen today the dark side of those activities, where many Americans who were not even suspected of crime were not only spied upon, but they were harassed, they were discredited, and at times endangered through the covert operations of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Such revelations place a serious responsibility upon this committee to see to it that that can't happen again. And the various devices for administering the toxin that were found in the laboratory certainly make it clear that purely defensive uses were not what the agency
was limited to in any way. There were definite offensive uses. In fact, there were dart guns. You mentioned suicides. Well, I don't think a suicide is usually accomplished with a dart, particularly a gun that can place the dart in a human target in such a way that he doesn't even know that he's been hit.
There's no question about it. It was also for offensive reasons.
Isn't it true, too, that the effort not only involved designing a gun that could strike a human target without knowledge of the person who'd been struck, but also the toxin itself would not appear in the autopsy?
Well, there was an attempt.
Or the dart?
Yes, so that there was no way of perceiving that the target was him. Now, I cannot explain why that quantity was developed, except that this was a collaboration that we were engaged in with the United States Army, and we did develop this particular weapon, you might say, as a for possible use. When CIA retained the amount that it did, it obviously did it improperly.
But we have an agency about which there's some question as to its accountability to the authority of the President or to the authority of the National Security Council. The record seems to disclose that there is no presidential or Security Council order in the first place directing the CIA to establish this program at all. Secondly, there appears to be no report by the CIA to higher authority of the existence of these toxins or biological weapons. Thirdly, there seems to be no evidence that those in charge of the CIA inquired of subordinates as to the existence of toxins or biological weapons, or that following the presidential order decreeing the destruction of such toxins, that any formal order went forth within the CIA to require their destruction.
You've heard of the doctrine of plausible deniability.
Yes, and I've rejected it now, Senator. I say that we cannot depend upon that anymore.
The question I was going to put to you, is that a phrase of art in the intelligence community? Does it have a separate significance that you understand?
It was a rationale used in earlier years.
What does it mean?
If the United States could deny something and not be clearly demonstrated as having said something falsely, then the United States could do so.
In the case of assassinations, in the case of any other domestic surveillance, in the case of the formulation of poisons, under that previous rationale, would the doctrine of plausible deniability have led the agency to destroy records, to conceal evidence, or to compartmentalize to the point where it would be a committee such as this later would have been unable to establish what really happened?
I think the plausible denial concept was used in the sense of international diplomatic relationships.
Are you saying by that it would not have applied to the formulation of toxic materials?
I would not say that it didn't have anything to do with it at all.
The committee does not believe that the acts which it has examined represent the real American character. They do not reflect the ideals which have given the people of this country and of the world hope for a better, fuller, fairer life. We regard the assassination plots as aberrations. The United States must not adopt the tactics of the enemy. Each time the means we use are wrong, our inner strength, the strength which makes us free, is lessened.
You take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you.